Hello and welcome to the next class for British and American poetry. And today we are going to do another British poet, a very famous one, W.B. Yeats. Now I say British, but actually he's an Irish poet. He's an Irish poet, and that is very important because the themes of his poetry are extremely Irish. They are uh, he takes an issue. He for him being Irish is an important uh, aspect of his identity and his poetry. Now we are going to do this poem called The Second Coming, and it's a very famous poem. It's one of the most anthologized poems. You would find it in most of the anthologies of poetry where there is poetry by W.B. Yeats. So there is Sailing to Byzantium, and then there is The Second Coming. And The Second Coming is a complex poem. It's a very complex poem, and therefore I want you to pay attention to it. Uh, it's a complex poem because one, it has certain themes which are very wide ranging. He picks up themes from uh, older Greek and Latin literature, mythologies. He picks up themes from contemporary politics, and of course Bible, right? Very Christian themes, the very idea of the second coming of Christ, right? The day of judgment. So the very idea of the second coming is a very biblical idea. So these are all combined together to create this very complex poem. So we are going to, it was published in 1989. Now it was published, the poem was published in 1919, my mistake, 1919. So does that make any, is that year of any significance for you? Does that year in any way ring any bells? What could he be writing? 1919. Now, 1919 was the year immediately after the First World War. It was immediately after the First World War. It was immediately after the Russian Revolution. And It was somewhere we are already going on. The First World War led to Second World War, and there's not much of a time gap between the two world wars. So it's that, it is that compressed years between the two world wars. And First World War was nothing like any other war that mankind had ever seen before. It was fought on a massive scale, the use of weaponry. It was almost like apocalyptic. It was a vision of apocalypse for the contemporary uh, people who had seen the war unfold, who had seen the politics and the war unfold in front of their eyes. For them, it was nothing short of an apocalypse. It was nothing short of the destruction of the world, and therefore, the idea of second coming, the day of judgment is near, the end of the world is near. So 1919, it was also the year of the Irish War of Independence. As I said, being Irish is very important for W.B. Yeats. So it was the War of Independence fought between the Irish Republican Army and the British forces. So between 1919 and 1920. So all these upheavals, the violent upheavals around the world find an expression in the imagery, in the poem, in the poetic imagery of this particular poem, The Second Coming. So pay attention, it is a complex poem and I will try and simplify it for you as we go. Turning and turning in the widening dryer, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. So let's go, that is the first stanza, and then there is another stanza. So it seems like a short poem, but actually it is loaded with meaning, right? It is an example of how poetry can say such deep things, such wide-ranging things within the concise form and within the restraint of words, constraint of words, rhyme, rhythm, it can say a lot of things. So let's go over it line by line. Turning and turning in the widening dryer. What is a dryer? I have an image here for you of the dryer. Here it is. That is a dryer. Right, turning and turning. So there is here a focal point, and then it rises ever widening, turning and turning. It turns around, it swirls and widens, right? It widens here. So turning and turning, the repetition of the word turning here, the repetition of the word turning and turning in a way suggesting constant non-stop movement, turning and turning of the widening gyre, an ever widening concentric spiral here, ever widening concentric spiral here. Now this gyre in Yeats symbolism, and he had a very elaborate system of symbolism. Now this represents trends of history, trends of development, trends of ideas. So it starts in a small focal, and then the ideas, the trends expand, ever widening. So the age and times, ideas spread, spiral, and they become wider, they spread wider and wider until all the force is spent and it ends there. They end with all the force spent, they have become too wide, they're no longer feasible. It started with a center, right? So here he says, as a gyre widens, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The center cannot hold, things fall apart. Now, the center of the gyre cannot hold as the ideas, as the times, as the age gets wider and wider, the center, the hold of the center is loosened, right? It cannot hold. And according to Yeats, it's going back to the poem here. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosened upon the world. But before that, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Now, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Falcon is a bird. Again, I have an image here for you. Falcon. It's a bird. You would often see the bird kept by hunters, right? The bird kept by hunters, and it would fly around in the medieval times, spot the prey, and go back to the hunter, and hunter would wear and perch on the arm of the hunter. The hunters would wear gloves, and the bird sits on the arms of the on the arm perches on the arm of the hunter, and you might have seen this medieval imagery. So the sorry, coming back here. So the falcon cannot hear the falconer. So but the bird does not hear the master, the person who provides nourishment, the person who keeps the bird, the master. So the falconer has lost control of falcon. The falcon does not, the bird no longer obeys the falconer. And that is what he means by turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. So the bird who swirls and swirls in the sky is no longer in control of the falconer. The things have fallen apart. So it's an image. This is the first image of the things falling apart in the world. Uh, it could be a symbol of mankind cannot hear what the guide, the voice. It could be God, it could be the moral guide, Christ. Again, the reference to second coming here. So mankind cannot hear its guide. It cannot hear Christ, cannot hear its spiritual guide, as you want to read it. Now, the second coming, one of the interesting things about the second coming is that it's a writerly poem. What do I mean by writerly poem? Yeats has just given us these words and these images, how to interpret this poem. What meaning does it make? What sense does it make? It depends on the readers. It depends on how you interpret, how you read the poem. So in that sense, it's a writerly poem. We as readers write meaning into the poem. The poem just gives us a set of indicators. It gives us a set of images, and we are supposed to give meaning to it. Unlike a readerly poet, where we are supposed to read the author's intentions, the author's meaning in the poem. So instead of giving us all the meanings for us to make out, Yeats leaves us with these images for you to give meaning to it, to give an interpretation to it. So it's in that sense, as I say, it's a writerly poem. We write meaning into it. We write the poem as we read it. So coming back, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. It could be mankind and its spiritual guide. The spiritual guide. You can pick up this theme from the title, the second coming, and refer to the biblical uh, imagery here, and therefore the falconer becomes Christ, God. But if you want to read it in a more secular fashion, then falcon could be mankind and cannot hear the falconer, cannot hear the spiritual guide. So things fall apart, right? Things fall apart. This is a very powerful phrase, and here it ends with a kind of a break. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. As I said, here it's an image of a gyre, and the center cannot hold, so things fall apart. Things fall apart because the center cannot hold, and it kind of explodes, right? It explodes. Uh, the gyre explodes. It's the so the mere anarchy is loosed upon the world when the center cannot hold, when the ideas which started the world, which held the sway in the ages, which conditioned the ages, cannot hold any longer. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed. So what happens in this anarchy? Blood-dimmed tide is loosed. Violence, there is violence, there is conflict, there is bloodshed. It's loosed upon the world, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Ceremony of innocence on a very literal level, it could be just the ceremony of baptism in Christianity, where every child is held under holy water and then brought out, and the child is baptized, right, accepted in the fold of Christianity. Now, but here, ceremony of innocence is drowned. It is drowned. It is it's drowned in the blood dimmed tide. It's drowned in the blood dimmed tide. So innocence, the ceremony of innocence is not just baptism. It is basically the tension between ceremony and innocence. So innocence is no longer real. It's just a ceremony. It's just a ritual. It's just empty. It is drowned. The meaning of the ceremony of innocence, the meaning of innocence is drowned in the blood dimmed tide. So again, if you want to return to the Christian imagery, this is blood dimmed tide is loose. It's probably the reference to Noah and his ark and the floods, and where ceremony of innocence, the beasts and the birds are drowned. So it is kind of linked to that apocalyptic vision where there is a flood loosened upon the world, destroying the world, and there is destruction all around. The best lack all conviction. The best lack all conviction. The people who are good, who know, who could probably lead the world, right? Who could be the spiritual guides. Why is the center not holding? Because the best lack all conviction. They lack force. They lack energy. They lack the power to lead the people. While the worst are full of passionate intensity. The worst are full of passionate intensity. The evil, the greedy, they're full of passionate intensity. They are the ones shouting the loudest. They are the ones leading the people, whereas the best lack all conviction. So this is a kind of an apocalyptic vision where he sees all this anarchy loosed upon the world. And this is the scene that is set for the second coming. Remember, in terms of place the scene, you can place the scene in terms of biblical imagery, but you can also place the scene in contemporary history, right? The year after the First World War. So it is also a reference to the destruction, the blood-dimmed tide, the destruction loosened upon the world during the war. The ceremony of innocence is drowned, right? There is nobody innocent. There is nobody who's now not touched by the violence and the bloodshed uh, loosened by the war on mankind. So so the scene is set for second coming. Now let's see the second coming. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. It's almost a repetition of this word surely at the start of these two sentences in the next paragraph. It's almost that the poet is trying to reassure itself. Surely there is come on, there is something going to, there is second coming. There is revelation. This is the doomsday. Come on, this is what the day of doom looks like. So it's time to not just reassure us, but also reassure himself that surely this is a time of doom, this is a time of second coming. But what kind of second coming? Is it the second coming of Christ? The second coming? Hardly are those words out when a vast image of the Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Spiritus Mundi, what does this phrase refer to? Sorry. It is basically the collective spirit of mankind. It is a collective spirit, as I said, of mankind. And it is loosened upon. He says it's kind of loosened upon the world. Yeah. So collective spirit of mankind, and hardly are those words out when a vast image is out of spiritus mundi, out of the collective spirit of mankind. There is an image, a vast image rising out of the collective spirit of mankind, and it troubles my sight. It troubles my sight. Somewhere in the desert, somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. What is this image that arises out of the collective spirit of mankind? What is this image? What is this creature that rises out of the spiritus mundi? Somewhere in the somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of man. Does it remind you of something? Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with a lion body. Okay, so a sphinx, right? The sphinx in the deserts of Egypt. So with the head of the lion and the body, sorry, with the head of the head of a man and body of a lion, somewhere in the sands of the desert. So what kind of second coming, sorry, what kind of second coming is it? It is the image of this vast image that arises out of the collective spirit of mankind. This is the image loosened upon the world in the second coming. Not really a very Christ-like image. A gaze, and with a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, with a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. So it's not really, as I said, not a very Christ-like image. It is almost inhuman. Gaze, it's inhuman. It is not animal, not man, a kind of a hybrid creature with gaze pitiless. Now look at these words that he is using to describe this creature. Blank and pitiless, not compassionate, not kind, not even judgmental. It is pitiless, it's blank, is So a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. Who are these desert birds? What kind of desert birds? So as this creature slouches on, slumbers on, rising out of the collective spirit of mankind, with the shape of a shape with lion body and head of a man, so a hybrid, inhuman, almost a monstrous creature moving slowly with slow thighs, and all around it circle the desert birds, right? The birds of prey, the birds like vultures, around it, as if something there is destruction, and these birds are going to prey. These are the birds of prey, and they are going to prey on whatever is going to be destroyed by this collective spirit, this creature arising out of the collective spirit of mankind. And then darkness drops again. So this image ends. Darkness drops again. Notice the alliteration here. Darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep, again the alliteration, 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Now these are quite complicated lines and quite unexpected lines. So it's like in the poet's vision, the darkness drops again. So this image ends, but now this image ends, and now I know this is knowledge, this is thought. So here it was the image, almost involuntary image, and now I know this is voluntary, this is knowledge that has come. The 20 centuries of stony sleep that this creature is arising out of 20 after 20 centuries of stony sleep. This particular creature, right? This creature that arises out of 20 centuries of stony sleep is vexed, but it's not arising pleasantly, it's not arising voluntarily, it's not awakening on its own, it is annoyed. It's annoyed, were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. The 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. Rocking cradle, again go back to the widening dryer, the anarchy that is loosed on the world. So the world is like a rocking cradle. The center cannot hold. The entire world is rocking, its foundations are rocking. And I find this very interesting. I find this image very interesting because, when you talk about rocking cradle, it's like, you are talking about in terms of a child being rocked, being soothed by mother or some kind of a caregiver, a child being rocked in the cradle. But here he's inverting that image, right? Rocking cradle is a world being rocked by anarchy, right? The cradle is a world that is being rocked by anarchy around. So 20s, and that anarchy, that rocking has wakened this indignant creature out of the nightmare. It is after 20 centuries of stony sleep, the stone creature, out of its stony sleep, it was sleeping, it was slumbering, and now it has awakened after 20 centuries. Now Yeats had created this very elaborate mythology and symbolism, and he, according to that vision, or according to that symbolism that Yeats had worked out, this change, the center and then the widening of the gyre, it kind of takes 20 centuries, right? 20 centuries, almost 2000 years. 20 centuries would be okay. So 20, let's stick with that. 20 centuries. It takes 20 centuries for the widening gyre, and every time the widening gyre, and every time it is a movement of change, right? It is a movement of change. So every age starts, widens. Look at this. Every age, look at the red one. Every age starts. It starts at the center, but the center widens and widens and widens and loses its hold till it ends. And here is anarchy. Here is all anarchy, here is all chaos, here is all violence. And from this is born the second coming, the new ideas, the new age, the new trends of thought, and then it goes on a narrowing. So, so it is like it's a birth of new age. It's a birth. That is why the second coming is a birth of new age, birth of new times. So, coming back to the poem, this is a time of change. This is a time of second coming. But this is not the second coming. It is not a p. It is not about judgment. It is not about judging the day of judgment. It's not compassionate. It's not a Christ. It's not Christ-like figure who's coming, but a beast, rough beast, right? A rough beast. The rough beast who had been sleeping for 20 centuries and is now awakened into a nightmare by the rocking cradle, by the rocking world, shaking world. And now this rough beast, its hour has come around at last. At last, it is time for him to take over the world, this violent world. The stage is set for this beast to take over the world. And it slouches towards Bethlehem. Again, we come back to biblical imagery, the place of the birth of Christ. But this time it is not Christ, it's almost like an antichrist, a rough beast that slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's slouching towards Bethlehem. So this image, this world is not a setting for the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ. It is a second coming of this rough beast, right, of the Antichrist. And he ends with a question mark here, as if, is this the second coming? Is this what was promised to us? Is this the second coming that was promised to us? So as you can see, it is a very apocalyptic, it presents a very apocalyptic vision of 1920s, and it is understandable because coming after the world wars, political upheaval, upheaval in terms of life, loss of human life, violence, bloodshed. So, the belief systems are shaken up. So the whole questioning, this question mark, I think, for questions not just it is a question, it poses a question, the poem poses a question to earlier belief systems. And is it the second coming of, is this the second coming that was promised to us? And if this is the second coming, then is it Christ, or is it a violent, bloody, rough beast that slouches towards Bethlehem to be born? Is it the coming of Antichrist? So that is this complex poem. Go over it, listen to it again. If we talk about its, I think the metrical pattern, it is again an iambic pentameter, but as if you do it carefully, if you try to work out its meter and syllables carefully, you will find that it is very loose. It is not. The dominant metrical pattern is iambic pentameter, but it is often loose. He lets go of the metrical pattern. At times it rhymes, world and whole, jar and Falconer, but then he does away with rhyme, right? At times he does away with rhyme pattern, he does away with rhythm, probably trying to imitate the violence, the anarchy that is loosened upon the world that he's writing about. So as I said, the form imitates the content of the